They say still water keeps secrets. That beneath the calm, glassy surface of a lake, there are stories the world isn't meant to hear, memories frozen in time. For the people of Crandall, Minnesota, that saying hit a little too close to home in the winter of 2021, when a team of volunteer divers went down into the frozen depths of Lake Merrow and surfaced with something no one expected. A car. Remarkably well preserved. And inside, a story that had been waiting nearly 40 years to be told. It started quietly, like most strange discoveries do. On February 6, 2021, the Crandall Dive Rescue Team was running a winter training exercise. Lake Merrow was a local favorite, shallow on the edges, deep at the center, and almost always covered in ice by late January. The team drilled holes into the frozen surface, setting up safety lines and gear. It was supposed to be routine. But about 20 minutes into the dive, one of the newer members, a guy named Eric, spotted something unusual on his sonar. A dark, rectangular shape, roughly 10 meters from the main drop zone. At first, he thought it was debris, maybe an old dock post or a sunken boat. But as the team followed the signal, the outline became clearer. There were curves, reflections. Glass. Metal. A car. The divers couldn't believe it. There were no records of a vehicle ever being lost in the lake. Crandall was small, and word traveled fast. If someone's car went missing, everyone would have known. But there it was. A fully intact sedan resting in the silt about 30 feet below the ice. When they surfaced and radioed it in, no one expected what would happen next. Within a few hours, the sheriff's department arrived with a recovery crew. The ice was thick, nearly 6 inches solid, but they managed to cut a large enough opening to pull the vehicle out. What came up through that hole wasn't just a rusted hunk of metal. It was a 1982 Buick Skylark. And when they opened the driver's side door, they found human remains. The body was seated behind the wheel, skeletal but intact, preserved by the cold water and layers of sediment. The license plate was still visible, the registration sticker faded but legible, Minnesota 1983. That one date, 1983, sent a chill through everyone on the scene. Because for those who'd grown up in Crandall, 1983 wasn't just a number. It was the year Sarah Whitaker disappeared. Sarah was 23 years old when she vanished. Back then, she was working at the local diner on Main Street, a small place called the Golden Spoon. Everyone in town knew her. She was bright, soft-spoken, with a kind of easy warmth that made her instantly likable. She had plans, too. She was saving money to move to Duluth, maybe start nursing school. But on the night of March 3, 1983, Sarah clocked out of work around 9 p.m., got into her blue Buick Skylark, and was never seen again. Her car disappeared with her. For months, search teams scoured the woods, the back roads, even the river that ran through the south end of town. But there was no trace. No car, no body, nothing. Eventually, the case went cold. Sarah's parents moved away a few years later. And like most small-town tragedies, her name became a quiet ghost, one you'd hear in whispers from people who remembered, but never really talked about anymore. Until that February morning, nearly 40 years later, when divers brought her car back from the lake's depths. The sheriff, a man named Tom Kessler, was just a kid when Sarah vanished. His father had been one of the original deputies on the case. So when the car came up, it hit him hard. He told reporters later, it was like time folded over. One second I'm looking at this old Buick dripping lake water, and the next I'm hearing my dad's voice talking about Sarah Whitaker again. It was surreal. The recovery team immediately secured the site and began processing the car as a crime scene. They found the remains in the driver's seat, still wearing traces of clothing, a ring on the left hand that matched the description from Sarah's missing person report. Dental records confirmed it within 2 days, the body belonged to Sarah Whitaker. But that was just the beginning. At first, investigators wondered if Sarah had accidentally driven into the lake that night, icy roads, poor visibility, a wrong turn. But something about the scene didn't sit right. For one, the car wasn't near any of the main access points to the lake. There were no tire marks, no broken barriers, no sign she'd gone through the ice. And the position of the car underwater, almost upright, with minimal damage, didn't line up with an accidental plunge. Then came the strangest detail. The driver's side window was rolled down halfway. And the seatbelt was buckled behind her back. Sheriff Kessler said it best, it looked staged. Like someone wanted it to look like an accident, but didn't understand how accidents actually work. They sent the car to the state forensic lab in St. Paul. Over the next few weeks, experts cleaned and examined every inch of it. They found trace fibers, remnants of duct tape under the seat, and what looked like faint abrasions on the steering wheel, as if someone else's hands had been there. Inside the glove compartment was an old photograph, water-damaged but visible. It showed Sarah at a bonfire, smiling with two men and another woman. That photo would become the key that reopened everything. The men in the photo were identified as Mark Heller and Don Avery, both Crandall locals who'd gone to high school with Sarah. The woman was Lisa Moore, her best friend and co-worker at the diner. Lisa had left town years ago, but Mark and Don still lived nearby. When investigators tracked them down, both were in their late 50s. Mark was a mechanic, Don worked part-time at a lumber yard. When asked about Sarah, both men claimed they barely remembered her. But as detectives dug into old records, they found something interesting. In March 1983, both Mark and Don had been questioned briefly during the original investigation. According to the old case notes, several witnesses reported seeing Sarah at the Rusty Nail bar the night she disappeared. She'd been talking with Mark, who at the time was her ex-boyfriend. They'd dated on and off for about a year before she broke it off. Friends said Mark didn't take it well. But without evidence or witnesses placing him near her car that night, police couldn't do much. That was then. Now, nearly 40 years later, technology could do what small-town police work in the 80s couldn't. The forensic team recovered hair and partial ridge patterns from the inside of the car's passenger door, evidence that had somehow survived decades underwater. And when those patterns were tested, they came back as a match to Mark Heller. When deputies brought him in for questioning, Mark looked stunned. He insisted he hadn't seen Sarah since the breakup, that any prints must have been from when they dated. But investigators weren't buying it. They pressed harder, revealing that the duct tape residue matched a brand only sold at a local hardware store back then, the same store where Mark had worked in 1983. Even more damning, the abrasions on the steering wheel lined up with the width of his hands. Faced with mounting evidence, Mark finally broke. But his confession wasn't what anyone expected. He said it wasn't supposed to happen like that. According to his statement, he'd met Sarah at the Rusty Nail that night to talk, to get closure, as he put it. They argued in the parking lot. She told him she was moving to Duluth, that she was done with him. Mark said he lost his temper. He grabbed her arm, she slapped him, and in a moment of rage, he shoved her. She hit her head on the car door and went limp. Panicking, Mark claimed he thought she was dead. He muttered that he didn't plan to kill her, he just snapped. He drove her car to Lake Merrow, found an old boat ramp that wasn't used much, and rolled the car into the water. But that detail didn't match the scene at all. There were no old ramps on that side of the lake. Investigators checked every shoreline, there was no ramp then, and no sign of one ever existing. His story didn't match the geography at all. So they pressed again. And this time, Mark's story changed. He admitted that Don Avery, his friend, had helped him that night. After realizing Sarah was still breathing, they decided they couldn't risk her waking up and going to the police. So they tied her hands, put her in the driver's seat, and pushed the car out onto the frozen lake themselves. They left the window halfway open, hoping the car would sink quickly once the ice gave way. Then they walked home. It was early morning when the sound of cracking ice echoed across the lake. By the time anyone noticed, the hole had already sealed over. Sarah Whitaker was gone. When the confession came out, it shook Crandall to its core. People who'd lived their entire lives thinking Sarah had vanished without a trace now had to face the reality that two of their neighbors, two ordinary men, had kept that secret for almost 40 years. Don Avery was arrested 2 days later. He denied involvement at first, but when shown Mark's signed confession, he crumbled. Both men were charged with second-degree murder and concealment of a body. The trial in 2022 drew national attention. Reporters filled the courtroom. Old locals came to watch, some of them crying as the prosecutor read out Sarah's last known moments. When the verdict was announced, guilty on all counts, there was silence. Then, from the back row, someone whispered, "Finally." For Sarah's younger brother, who was just 9 years old when she disappeared, it was the closure he'd waited a lifetime for. He told the court, "Every winter, I'd look out at that frozen lake and wonder if she was out there somewhere. Turns out, she was." But there was one final twist that few people know about. When forensic divers went back to Lake Merrow to map the exact site where the car was found, they discovered something else buried in the sediment nearby, a second object, partially covered by silt and weeds. It was a small, metal toolbox. Inside were tools, rope, and a single Polaroid photograph. The picture was warped by decades underwater, but clear enough to make out a car, Sarah's car, parked on the ice. Two men stood behind it, blurred but visible. Neither of them smiled. Authorities believe the photo was taken the night of the crime, possibly by one of the men themselves. It had sat there underwater all these years, waiting to be found. Today, Lake Merrow looks the same as it always has, calm, still, and eerily quiet in winter. People fish there, kids skate on its frozen surface, and the town moves on. But those who know what lies beneath say that on certain nights, when the ice creaks and the moon hits just right, you can almost see the shape of an old car beneath the surface, frozen in time, like a whisper from the past. A reminder that even in silence, the truth finds a way to rise. Because lakes don't forget. They just wait.